Years ago, I was in Matt Church's thought leadership school for some time, and he had a definition of leadership which I really liked. What I loved about it, though, was its connection to creativity. So he said that we all expect our leaders to take us from anxiety to confidence, and from confusion to clarity. And I would add, from a challenge to an opportunity, and also to be able to build, a vision for a better life for all. And the thing about that really resonated me with when he said it was, well, that's what creativity is, because when you're being creative, you've got to stay in anxiety longer, because you're stepping into the unknown. You have to be a little bit more confused because you don't know the answers, and that's part of the creative process. And creativity is all about taking on challenges and finding opportunities.
Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Conversations with Jonno White podcast. Today's guest, oh man, I always love having an Aussie, as much as I love international guests, and we've had many, there's something about chatting with another, particularly a Brisbane boy, that just really excites me. Today's guest, Paul Fairweather, said to me before we started the podcast that he was once best described by someone he worked with as part Zen, part espresso. And I said, we've got to use that in the introduction because that's piqued my curiosity. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jonno. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I can already tell it's going to be so much fun. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and as I've already given it away that you're based in Brisbane, Australia, like I am. But yeah, tell us a bit about yourself and I guess a snapshot of your journey.
Yeah, okay. I'll do my best to do that. Listen, I am currently a speaker and a trainer, and I am also a writer and a painter. I've been a painter for most of my life. There was a bit of a time in my 20s when I didn't paint, but primarily I've painted my whole life. But I'm a trained architect, and so I had a large practice that I built a partnership called Fairweather Probates that I sold my share in about 15 years ago to do other things. So, and those other things, included specifically around this speaking and training. In that 15-year period, I did accidentally fall back into architecture again and ended up doing probably the tallest building I had done, which was 18 stories, but it's not really what I intended. So since pre-COVID, I've been in this world of speaking and training.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think, we can all resonate with accidentally building a really tall building. I love that. Actually, I don't normally start here, but I just can't help but ask. Leaving something like architecture, which from what I understand from mates of mine who are architects, has to be one of the most challenging industries to get into in terms of the training. It's really, really a hard slog. Can you just give us a bit of insight into 15 years ago, making that big call to sell your part in the practice and step out, into speaking?
Look, it's interesting, and your friends are right. It is a hard slog. In fact, I have the record at QUT for the longest it's taken anyone to get a degree of 11 years. But of course, back in those days, there was no HECS debt. So if it was now, I'd still be paying it off, I think. And I got over the line eventually, and I worked, for a variety of different people and did different things. But in 1990, in the recession that we had to have, apparently the only job I could find was if I employed myself. And so I started my practice by myself. I had no assets. I was in my early 30s. And I had $6,000 in the bank, and I had no work. And at the end of 6 months, I had no money, and I was really getting quite desperate. And a big job walked in the door, and from there, I just grew. And so over the next 20 years, took on a partner, and we ended up with around 55 people. So I suppose eventually, look, probably the biggest thing for me in terms of architecture is the time frame. I am an ideas person. I love the front end of a project. I love winning a project. But spending 2 or 3 years working on the same house is what it takes, for a big house from go to go, is really, I suppose, stretched my imagination in some ways. And I just had this, inkling to do other things. And so the opportunity arose for me to sell my share. My kids were about the same age as your kids are now. In fact, my daughter was, I think, 9 months when I walked out the door, and my son was about 3. So it was an interesting journey. I got to say that it was, in the GFC, and it was difficult doing what I wanted to do, partly because I didn't really know exactly what it is, and I didn't know how to do it. And I suppose in the end, I didn't really have the balls to say, this is what I want to do. I want to do things about ideas and stuff. So I did, fall back into architecture. Not what I intended, but it just sort of one thing led to another. And it took me a long time to get back out of it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I what I love about your story is, how you started. I think one thing I've learned from this podcast, and I've learned more from this podcast than anything else I've ever done. I always say that there's something about intently listening. I hope I do that anyway, but when you're recording a podcast, you're really kind of on your toes listening, and so I've just found the conversations fascinating and really challenging. And your story, I've heard it so often. These, in my opinion, amazing leaders, and you kind of expect them to say, well, I started with my 7-year plan to do my own thing. And I remember the funniest story that comes to mind is someone who said, they're now doing amazing things in leadership in C-suite. And their first role they had was their manager said to them, look, I've asked 4 other people and they don't want to do this kind of role. How about, do you want? And we just laughed at, like, that is the worst pitch to promote someone. And they were like, yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. And so they were the 5th choice, and now that was there. So I like that for you as well. It's like, well, you couldn't, there weren't any other jobs going, so you kind of stepped out and started your own thing. And 6 months, I bet that felt like a long time before that first big project walked in the door.
Well, the first any project walked in the door. And the interesting thing is, I shared an office with a guy that I studied with, and then my future business partner moved in, and another architect, and I really had no work. But we had this old building called Rechabite House in Edward Street, and I rented the whole top floor for absolute song, a couple $100 a month. This huge building with a light well in the middle, and as my artist studio, because I was a pretty prolific painter at the time. But the really interesting thing was that I really found it difficult, and even now I sometimes struggle to see the painting as work. And so it was pre-mobile phones. I had a phone line that ran up the light well to my studio upstairs. But I felt that although I had no architectural work, I didn't want clients to know that I wasn't doing architecture, that I was painting. And so I found it very difficult to stand upstairs and paint. So I just sort of sit and look at the phone downstairs. But what was really interesting in the end, when I did, I suppose, started building a practice and come out as an artist, so to speak, it really benefited both because my clients wanted a piece of me, and so I had lots and lots of clients who wanted to buy my art. But then also the clients gave me leeway because I was a creative. I was really highly creative, and I'm a painter, and so I got this sort of permission to be even more creative as an architect. So it was really interesting. But I had this mental block about the practicing artist and architect, that that people would see that as not being professional, I suppose.
Yeah, isn't it funny about the perceptions we have? I definitely think we all have, unchecked. There's probably some interesting things in terms of how we're framing ourselves and what we do. I was just sitting down over coffee with someone yesterday, and he was generous enough to, and I know him well enough that I said, hey, can I just challenge you on something? Because he just said something about himself where I was like, you know what, you reframe it like this, and it's completely different. The way you say it makes it sound really limiting, and so it was interesting. I want to jump into your, I guess, back to the beginning of your story, I want to ask you about, Paul, as a young person. You mentioned you grew up in Townsville. I'm interested to know when you were growing up and maybe when you were a teenager. As you look back, are there any moments that stand out that really shaped you as a leader, or where you think, oh yeah, there was the entrepreneur in Paul, or the leader, or the speaker, or the artist when you were young?
Yeah, look, it's sort of back to the leadership thing, and I think about this because I suppose the interesting thing about leadership is that there is no mold. We all have our own style, and I think the thing for me, and I look back, was that I was always building things, and bringing other people along, building go-karts out of stuff from the tip and pram wheels and, all sorts of things, or, rearranging my sister's tricycle to make a three-wheeler, and always sort of building things. And I think that probably, that's the thing for me when I end up in practice was, I was trying to build a business. I was a big fan of the E-Myth. And so I was really, that was my real drive was. I think in terms of sort of jumping forward a little bit, but the bit that I didn't really expect, and the hardest thing about selling, my share of the practice, was I did lose my tribe. I discounted, because I'm often in my head. I discounted the effect it would have on me to go from leader of a large practice to being a solo entrepreneur sort of thing. But yeah, I think that was sort of the thing. And I also remember, and there's sort of stories to why I stopped doing this stuff, which is all a bit traumatic. But I was always putting on plays and things, and getting people along to do that sort of thing. Building sets and all that sorts of stuff. So I always had this thing of wanting to get people building things.
Yeah, which links, obviously that's such a clear link, building things to architecture. But like you said, it's also the case of building a business and growing a practice. 55 employees is a big, that's anyone who's led that many people or being close to people who are leading that many people knows that's a tough gig. That's a significant leadership role. Yeah,
it is, and it's not. It wasn't easy. We had a dual leadership, which had its own challenges. It was certainly there was a lot of benefit, but like a lot of partnerships, there's always a downside or a dark side, to that. But yeah, so and I think that's it's interesting. I look back and think about it. The thing was, there was one particular guy who I studied with, who's a lifelong friend, and he came on board as a junior director. He was a real people's person, and he really did drive the culture. And I sort of realised that he was in a lot of ways a key to the success of sort of picking up the ball of that, because I was always moving on to, I had bright shiny new object syndrome, so I was always moving on to something else. But I always needed people to catch my ideas and take them to fruition, and he caught the people and made sure that they were properly cared for.
Yeah, I remember doing a coaching session once where I was the coachee, and we were talking about StrengthsFinder and my strengths, and one of my top strengths, or my number one strength, is futuristic. And it was interesting sitting down with him, because I remember this coach, he said to me, Jonno, you'll naturally be great at kind of seeing the picture of what the future could be, but you need people to help you actually really paint that, and then to help other people to see it for what it is. Yeah. And I thought that was really profound, because when you see the picture so clearly in your head, it can definitely feel like, what's wrong with everyone? Like, why doesn't everyone just see this amazing thing we're all going to do together? Getting people, getting it really painted in a way that people can understand it, is one thing that I severely underestimated how challenging that is. And then getting people to see it and actually capture the vision of what you're trying to do is like a whole nother thing that's really challenging to do.
Mm. Yeah, no, look, yes, that is so true. And I suppose, I always said, which is not, well, it's about leadership, but it's sort of a different, version of it. In architecture, we are in the communication business, because we were at every stage, what we were doing is communicating ideas or how to build something, in concept or design development or for approvals or for construction. So, and that's that thing of helping people see their vision, because, a lot of people know what they want, but they don't know how to express it or what it would look like. And I think that probably the thing that I remember most was people would come in with a brief, and we start working, talking about it, and at some stage, after digging, they'd say, well, actually, what we really want is this, and there's another layer there, and say, okay, well, but we tried to make it fit, but we couldn't make it work, so we dropped that part of it. And I went, okay, well, why don't you just give me the full brief of what you want and let me see, because, trust me, I'm an architect, and how we can go there. And, so often we come back with a solution and they go, wow, how'd you do that? So, well, we're trained, we're trained to see things differently and, and playing with it. And I think that's sort of part of that same thing of leadership. They knew what they wanted to create something, but they didn't know how to articulate it in the language of construction or design to fruition.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you another question about what you shared there about the communication side in a second. I'll come back to that because I really want to get your thoughts on the perception of value, which I think is really interesting coming from your background in architecture. So I'll come back to that. But one thing you mentioned in passing was the idea of getting up and doing plays. And you mentioned in passing that it was a bit of a traumatic story. Now, if that's something you don't want to share, just feel free.
No, it's fine. I've actually, it's in my currently being edited book. But look, there was a couple of things. And it's interesting how our voice gets cut back. But I used to join choirs and stuff. And when I was in grade 10, I joined the school musical, and interestingly, I got the job of painting the sets, and they were big half a tennis court size sets by myself. A mate joined me who wasn't even in art class, and we did that. But I was in the Pirates of Penzance. I was in an all boys school, and we were doing it with the girls' school down the road. And during the very last dress rehearsal, the night before opening, the musical director stopped proceedings. Stop! You there in the blue, and we're all policemen, but you, me, yes, you. Stop, sing a few bars. And so I sang a few bars. She went, oh my God, you can't sing. You have to mime. And so this is after 3 months of rehearsals. After an audition, she decided I couldn't sing. And the thing was that, she said, oh, you sing flat. And no one explained it to me. And I just imagined that was, some deformity of my vocal cords, that the notes, some magical thing when notes come out, they came out flat, like they'd been through a ringer or something. And so it took me a long time to get over that. And literally in my 20s, I had a friend who was a musician. We did a deal that I'd do him some posters, and he would teach me to sing one song, Daydream Believer. So I did the posters, screen printed posters for his show that he was doing at the Normanby Hotel. And one night I was at a party and he was playing, and I'd been somewhere else, and I was a bit drunk, and he convinced me to come up on stage and sing the song with him. And at the end of it, looked at me and said, I have to renege, you're unteachable. So it wasn't until my 50s that I finally had the courage to go and have singing lessons. And there's a big, long story involved in that. But, I know that I'm not a good singer, but I love singing. And so I do at a lot of opportunities. And I have sung solo in public, not very well, but, I'm singing and I love it. So And when I tell that story, so many people of my vintage, and I'm mid-60s, go, yeah, I had the same experience. And whether it was about someone saying you can't draw, or you can't paint, or you can't sing, or that's shit, you can't write, and just close down people's creative expression. And for me, it's really it's such a shame.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. That is just, I really feel that as you, like, that's just a punch in the gut, just hearing that story of being singled out like that. And oh man, that's just horrible. I think for me, one thing we were talking about perception before as well, and I think I've had this perception of myself around art and around drawing and painting. I never was interested in drawing growing up, and I don't have any memories of being specifically told I was terrible at it when I was little or anything, but I definitely know that because I didn't do it much, when I did ever draw anything when I was a bit older and say a teenager, it would be laughably bad, because it's when you're drawing, well, you're often, playing Pictionary or something, and you're just like, and so it kind of reinforced this idea that I couldn't do that. And I had never questioned that until recently, and I thought a bit like you with your journey with singing. I think recently it's been like, wait a second, like this is a skill that I can develop, and also I might really enjoy painting or drawing, and that's and whether other people love it or it looks the same as other people actually is subjective, and that's like, it's all so subjective, and to the point where I remember being so stoked. This is so funny to think about, but something that I remember for my niece, who's now 11, Sophia. When she was a bit younger, she went through a My Little Pony stage, and I remember there was this time where I was like, she was like, draw a My Little Pony, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to. So I worked really hard to like really properly draw out and properly like copy how a My Little Pony is done. And she was like, oh, Uncle Jonno, your My Little Pony is way better than Auntie Liz's, my wife. And I remember being so proud. I was like, yeah, that's right. Like, I can draw. I drew like the best My Little Pony. And which is such a funny thing that stands out in my memory so much. But it's something for me that I'd love to, I guess, loosen up a bit about. And because I'd never thought of painting for fun or as a hobby, but it's something I actually really want to do.
Yeah, well, look, it is so interesting, and maybe we need to have a coffee sometime and chat. In the workshops and masterclasses I run, I get people drawing. I actually get them painting, and it's not it's not the end. It's about the process. But what it's really about is a small piece of building creative confidence. That's what I do. But what I say to people is, they say I can't draw, and I go, well, if you make a mark on the paper and it's not a word, or not writing, then we consider it drawing. Even if it's just a line. And as you say, it's totally subjective about whether that's a good drawing and stuff. And what happens is, I know you say you don't recall drawing. I'd be very surprised if you didn't at some stage, even if you were sort of made to. But most people, draw, as kids with abandon. But when we reach puberty and we have this we become very conscious, and we don't want to do anything that's not realistic. So if we can't make it photorealistic, then we shy away from it. And then on top of that, with actual lack of support or actual discouragement from peers and teachers and parents, we end up abandoning not just drawing, but sort of most forms of creative expression, and which I think is really, is it's a big problem, And I know the schools, after my kids have just been through schools, it's getting better, but it's still, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, schools is the number one sector I work with around leadership, and I love chatting with educational leaders about topics like this. I think this is just one part of because I think the whole education system is a head scratcher about how to make it more effective. It's something I'm really passionate about. And this is an area where I think the biggest challenge I see for schools is, you need assessment, you need data, you need to be able, in order for the system to be effective. That's the way it's seen anyway. Like, we need the data so that we can improve things, know what to do. But because you're looking at data, that means you're automatically scoring and giving people a score for whether they've done well or poorly at something, which means what you've got young people who are being reinforced really early, either in a positive way, that they're really good at something, or in a negative way that they're not good at it. And so for me, I chat with educational leaders about, well, how do we get to the point where a young person, like in a system that's so built on outcomes and scoring, what does it look like for Jonno White to grow up? If you could go back to my childhood, for me to, at school, learn the enjoyment and the art of creativity and the skill of creativity as significant in itself, regardless of the outcome or where I sit, A, B, C, D, E. It's like, how do you do that in a system that's built on scores and data?
Yes, no, it is really difficult. And I think the thing is that the reason that it's important is, and because I know this is about leadership, your podcast. I years ago I was in Matt Church's thought leadership school for some time, and he had a definition of leadership which I really liked. What I loved about it, though, was its connection to creativity. So he said that we all expect our leaders to take us from anxiety to confidence, and from confusion to clarity. And I would add, from a challenge to an opportunity, and also to be able to build, a vision for a better life for all. And the thing about that really resonated me with when he said it was, well, that's what creativity is, because when you're being creative, you've got to stay in anxiety longer, because, you're stepping into the unknown. You have to be a little bit more confused because you don't know the answers. And that's part of the creative process. And, creativity is all about taking on challenges and finding opportunities. And so I think that, if our leaders were more creative, and, and obviously, it's changing today, but when I was, growing up and, as a young architect, the leader was a very A-type leader. This is where we're going. It's not who's coming with me. This is where we're going. Do it this way, with the expectation that the leader always knew the answer. But when you're being creative and creating something that didn't exist before, you don't know the answer by its very nature. And I think that what I do in my work now is to help people build a creative confidence with some very small, simple techniques around drawing and a little bit of watercoloring, to go, yeah, I can do this, and maybe I can do other things as well.
That's so good. I'm really catching myself with my son, Roman, who's, 2 years and 8 months, catching myself on the things that I reinforce, as his dad, and how I, and I agree, like what you said about the A-type leader. I think the future is, and I don't really know, and maybe this is part of the creativity, right? Like I don't know how to get there yet, but one thing I know for sure is that the most effective leaders in the coming decades will have the ability to lead in such a way. One concrete example would be to find people, put them into roles, and then allow them to expand and grow and move out of their organization or move across their organization. And once you start talking about medium or large size businesses, that becomes incredibly complex, because jobs just have to be done as part of the system. So how do you treat people and invest in people in such a way that not what we were doing 30 years ago, where it was like, well, that person's going to be in that role for the next 20 years. But if you're going to be effective, you're going to have to start them there, but then learn about them and then grow with them and then see where they could go, and also potentially let them go. That, I think, is one of the greatest challenges for leaders in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, and look, it's interesting you say that because my experience on that was in architecture was very much about that. Some architects are very didactic. Do it this way. I, whilst I had the reputation, I had some very strong design skills in spatial planning, but three-dimensional volumes not so much. But I used to sort of think it like bumper rails on the bowling. So I would sit down with someone and give them some ideas, but really give them the boundaries for their ideas and go and get them to explore, and then come back. And if they jump to the next lane, bring them back to this lane and go, okay, yeah, that's great, but that's for something else. We're at this lane here. And as you go over time, those bumper lanes get wider and wider, and people start to think in the same way, and they understand where the boundaries are. And I think that's probably an important thing. And a lot of creatives talk about this as well, is that sometimes it's so much easier to have a brief, to design to a brief, rather than having open slather. Just do whatever you want, because we have no boundaries, and so it's often we need boundaries. And I think part of that leadership and training is to define the boundaries of what is possible, and what's expected, but what is possible more than anything else.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love that idea of the bumper lanes and the boundaries. Coming back to what piqued my interest before, just as you were talking about architecture and the value, it's something that popped into my head that I'm always interested in understanding more, is around the psychology of for leaders, but really particularly people in, say, the service industry. The difference in value between one architect who is in the top price range and another who's in the lower price range. From your experience in architecture, and actually just in general, what have you learnt about how to create value around something that is often an idea as an architect? Or someone might say, well, anyone could have done that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, like I often get that with my painting. Anyone could do. I could do that. They say, and I say, well, yeah, but you don't. Look, I think it's interesting. Yeah, you could, but you don't. Look, I think it's really interesting with architecture, and it's probably an episode in its own right, Jonno. I think there's definitely it's not so much a perceived value. There's definitely it's really about skill. There are some people are more skilled designers than others. But the value is not just in the design outcome, because architecture is a collaborative, long drawn out process that's involved lots of things. And, in the past, there's been, designers, great designers, but, lousy documenters. And, and the builder or the client would see not very good value in that, because, it would cost them a lot more in the end and dragged out and very stressful. So, I think the value in the end is one of, a high level of, design, documentation, communication across the board. The perceived value, I think it's interesting that when you mentioned that, the thing that struck me, or that came to mind initially, was so often architects are asked to just give us a bit of a sketch first, so we got an idea that you can do it, or a little unpaid competition. And we're such suckers that we go, yeah, like it's like a Charlie Brown and Lucy in the football, and we keep on lining up, because our greatest value is in those ideas, in those initial stages, because you can get it documented in India if you want. Yet we're forever giving away that value to people. But then you get to a level where you don't have to do that anymore, and people come to you. And it's normally, I think, if you develop a style, particularly, people want that style rather than a general architect that might respond in many different ways to different briefs. But there's certain architects out there that have a particular style, and so people want to go to them, and then they become in demand. Look, I think about Glenn Murcutt, who was a famous Australian residential architect, and he did the corrugated iron, curved roofs, and he created value because he only had one or two people working for him, and he only did one house at a time. So if you wanted to wait a Glen Murcutt house, you had to wait 2 or 3 years before he could start because he didn't multitask and he just wanted to. That's why he worked. So look, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's very complex in some ways, but when I think about it, I think about the people that seem to be in demand. Have a particular style, and therefore they can charge a premium.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think you articulated that really well around. And are you familiar with Daniel Priestley's work, Oversubscribed or Key Person of Influence? Have you come across him?
Yes, I am aware of. In fact, he popped up on my LinkedIn the other day. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I didn't do key person of influence, but I did go to one of their sessions. So
Yeah, I love his work. He's probably, an Aussie who's now in London. I really love his ideas around marketing because they ring the truest to me of anything I've come across in terms of you're just really nailing down what's going on at a psychological level. And he talks so much about supply and demand, which he talked about there with the architect who only had a couple of people working for him, did one house at a time. And now, intuitively you'd think, well, he's going to be less in demand than someone who's got a bigger team and is churning out work. But actually, it's the fact that his supply is so minimal that then means that even any normal amount of demand for him, it creates that extra value because now I've got to wait 2 years. And it's often, I think it's one of those things in business, it's so easy to talk about, but it's really hard to make those painful choices about your business somewhere where you do limit your supply because it sounds great on paper until you're not accepting, cash flow is king in particularly for small business. But the other thing I liked about what you shared there is also about the idea of the micro niche. And I can't remember if that's Daniel Priestley who talks about that. It might be, but I think it's so true. The idea of whatever you're doing, really try to, Amazon didn't take over the world. As Amazon, they took over books. If people can know you for books, and one thing really specifically, online book delivery, if you can nail down that style, that niche, that micro niche and own it, then more and more I'm coming to believe that is a really surefire way to own that niche. And then from there, potentially down the track, once you completely own that niche, then you expand. Once again, really hard to do, particularly for creative entrepreneurs, right? For me, I love working with people from so many different industries that choosing and really nailing down a micro niche is quite challenging.
Yeah, no, I think it's difficult. And but just, I suppose to, clarify that thing, there's two things. One is, for an architect, design is seen as the be all and end all, but you've got to be able to deliver. And there's a lot of young practices, they work in other firms, they've got great design skills, they go out, they do a great design, but it ends in tears. And they may or may not survive. And I think about the ones that have survived, who've gone through that process, really struggled the first couple of years, getting things built, but then they ended up not just good designs, but they also got good systems, and people, know they're going to get a quality product. And so, and I suppose the same thing with Amazon, that if you're going to order online, you're going to get the book, and you're going to get it quickly.
Yeah.
It's different to say, well, we own the niche, but, you got to wait a month for your book. So.
Yeah, they work hand in hand together. I think and that's, Daniel Priestley talks about delight. And I love that idea. I've been doing that with a client I do business coaching for, and we've just been looking at the customer journey and looking at where we can delight customers more across that journey. What are where are they? Well, the first thing to say is, okay, where are we really, pissing people off? Because if there's a point where that's happening, turn that around. But then ultimately, if you can delight, and that happens through systems, through communication, the things that are much less sexy than the idea and the design, but that's how you delight your customer or your client, is really thoughtful, intentional systems, understanding what it's like in their shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I reckon we need to do an episode number 2, because I barely asked you about your leadership journey. So this is an official invitation back for another episode and a coffee, since we're both in Brisbane.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's do that. Let's jump into Leadership Express. So I gave you a heads up on this one earlier. This is a great question from Tim Ferriss that he asked in his podcast. What book have you gifted the most to others?
Look, actually, I think that I actually don't give away a lot of books, but I recommend a lot of books, and I read a lot. And look, it's fairly recent, two books by the same author that I've read, which I think has opened my mind, opened my life up, which is Oliver Burkeman, and the books are Meditations for Mortals and 4,000 Weeks. And 4,000 weeks is basically, about the amount of weeks you have if you live to 80. And it's this whole thing of about, we have a mind that says that we can do anything we want, but we have a reality of a very, he calls it finitude, and I think to my mind, it really relates to everything, but particularly leadership, where are you going to put your attention? What are you going to do? What do you get distracted by? The Meditations for Mortals, the first line in the book is, this is a book about how the world opens up once you realize you're never going to sort your life out. Which I think is just absolutely brilliant. But the more of the thing is that you're not going to be able to do everything, and the list that you have, you're never going to get through. And I think it's a really good thing for leaders, because I think especially if they've got a lot of capacity, underneath them and facilitators and stuff, it's really important that the work that they direct their people to do is important.
Love that. Great recommendations. Thank you. What's a recent leadership lesson you've learned for the first time or been reminded of?
That's a good one. You got me on the spot, Jonno. My mind's gone blank.
We can come back to that one. It's that's the point of Leadership Express, just to see if something pops in your head. What about any great podcasts or books, blogs that you are, reading at the moment or really enjoying? Can be leadership, but can be anything.
Look, I love podcasts. Besides my own, the Common Creative. Look, another book that I've just finished today, which I thought was really interesting. Seth Godin, who I love. This is Strategy, but it's 229 chapters, I think, and it could have been 4 or 5 books. I think it's just a little bit too long. It's a real ramble, but it's got some really interesting stuff about strategy in there, and a really interesting way of looking at things. So I've really I've enjoyed that. I've got to say, and there's some snippets that came out. In fact, I took a note of one today, which I think is such an important thing that he just said very simply. He said, if you want to cause system change, find the insatiable desires and connect to them. And because in this book he talks a lot about systems, and how the strategy is all about working with the system or working against the system or changing the system. And I just love that. If you want to cause system change, find the insatiable desires and connect with them.
Yeah, I like that too. Really connects strategy with systems, with vision, with purpose. Like there's a lot in that short sentence that, is profound. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. What about a great piece of advice you've received at some point? Does anything come to mind?
Well, as Jake, my father-in-law, said, a wise man once said, nothing.
That is a good one.
But look, I think it comes back to, sort of one thing that, someone said to me, and it's very linked, I think, why Oliver Burkeman resonates with me so much, is that, Paul, you can do anything you want, but you can't do it all. And I think that's the thing, we and especially, because I'm in my mid-60s now, I've still got, hopefully quite a few productive years left. But yeah, it's, time is precious. You can't do everything.
Yeah, I think that's why I love Greg McKeown's books, Essentialism and Effortless. And he talks a lot about, in Essentialism, about trade-offs. There's always a trade-off. And I think that's why that resonated so much with me, because we want to believe everything's possible. And yeah, it's that idea that there's always a trade-off. And you can either be ignorant of that and act like it's not true and be, or you can accept that as a reality and really try to be much more intentional and pinpoint what you want to do or what you're going to trade.
Yeah, actually, yeah, okay, yeah, that's right. Just back to your question about leadership, and it's probably, I can't think of a recent one where it comes through, but the thing that I think both resonates most strongly with me in the things that I learn about leadership from other people was about taking responsibility. And often in architecture, it's difficult because we're told never admit responsibility. Never admit you made an error because of you get sued. And your PI won't support you if you admit that you made the mistake. But I worked for this. I worked for a builder for a couple of years, and I worked for an architect long since dead, Ian Ferrier, but his family's still around in practice. And I was doing the final summation of this project with him and going through the variations. And he went to one. He said, "Oh, that was our error." Glad at his son-in-law, who was an architect, and said, "We'll be paying for that." And that was it. That was the end of discussion. And that is the thing that the thing that I've learned, and when I look and I see it so often, where people don't take responsibility for their actions, their mistakes, and make things worse, but people do, who do go, yes, okay, I stuffed up, I made a mistake, I missed it, whatever, I take responsibility. We can then sort it out, and it gets away from that defensive, offensive thing.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that story. A story someone shared with me recently that stuck with me was they said they had a boss at one point who said to them, "Look, I just want you to know that when you make a mistake, all you need to do is come here and tell me privately what's happened. And once we sort that out in the room, I want you to know that it's not going to be, I'm not going to bring it up again. It's not going to be on my mind again. Like, it's done." And sure enough, he said, at some point he dropped the ball and he had that in his mind. He was like, so he went and booked a meeting and told him, "Look, I stuffed this up. I made this mistake." And sure enough, it wasn't like the guy, was like, "That's awesome." They worked it through. They found a solution for it. It, cost them money, whatever it was. There was a cost. But he said after that point, he never brought it up with him again. It wasn't something that hung over his head. He was like, "No, we sorted that out together," and they moved on. And I just thought, oh man, that is such a refreshing thing to hear from a leader, to say, you've got the permission to tell me, we're going to work through it together. I will be direct, but it's not, then you're not going to, you don't need to worry that it's going to be hanging in the back of my mind after that. We'll sort it out together and move forward. Yeah, that was just really profound.
Yes, I can see that. It's a great story as well.
Okay, last question. If you could only give one piece of leadership advice to a young leader, what would you say?
I would. Well, I do mentor a couple of people, and I tell them about owning up to their errors to their clients. That's what I tell them, because the fish rots from the head, and if if a staff member sees them, hiding errors, then that gives them permission to do the same thing. And so the biggest thing that I say is, in fact, I say to my kids, go out, have fun, but be careful. But you can't be careful. Don't get caught. And if you do get caught, take responsibility for your actions. That's really what it's about. So it's So I think it just comes back to that. And look, there's lots of other things that I've got that probably take a little bit longer, but I think the fish does rot from the head, and you got to lead by example.
Yeah, I love that. And there's just, it's crazy how many CEOs out there have employee surveys, performance management, but somehow it slipped through the cracks. They're not doing, say, 360-degree feedback for themselves.
Yeah.
And and it's like, no. anything you want to see in your culture, if you want people to be able to take feedback, then you've got to be the one that shows them I can do it. I can take feedback. People can tell me things that are uncomfortable for me to hear, and I cannot take it personally, and etc. That's such great advice about taking responsibility. Actually, there's a great Patrick Lencioni book called Getting Naked, which is a funny name for a book, but he's a leadership consultant. I love his work around leadership, and that book is really written for consultants about their style of consulting. And what I love about it is their ethos is be transparent, tell people, like, almost like leave your KPIs and agendas at the front door and just get in there and try to help them, even if that means helping someone. That's the idea of Getting Naked, is being transparent and saying, look, you know what you guys need is actually not what I do. Like, you would be much better off working with someone like this because of the size or style you're after. And that's scary, but I really do believe that if you can own that and hold that space with authenticity and integrity and turn away work at the right times, I think people go away and it in terms of your reputation and just, you know, what it's like to work with the people you work with, that's so rare. And it really is a point of difference if you can do that well, that when there's something in it for you, but it's not in the best interest of the other person, that you say, actually, you know what, I think you'd be better off doing X, Y, or Z. That approach for me, I love that. I try to do that, but it is hard. But like we said, when cash flow is, you know, for a small business is so important. But that is something that I'm really working on to build my consultancy around.
Yeah, well, that's great. Look, and it is a hard thing to do. And I was asked to do something recently, and I got excited about it. And then, you know, I should have said right from the beginning, no, it's not me. But then, you know, after the brief, I went back afterwards and said, oh, look, it's not me. And I'm very disappointed. So I should have said it from the start. So I think you've got to, you know, as soon as you know, that's the time to tell them, because people do get invested otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, not being afraid to disappoint people. Coming back to that, the residential architect you mentioned who made people wait, I think it's not like you want to purposefully find ways to annoy people, but what you do want to do is be okay doing things in your lane really well in a way that gets the best results. And if that means you disappoint someone, you can't meet their schedule, and therefore they need to go elsewhere or wait, then that's okay. And in the long term, that's plays out for the best.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes back to that value thing, because, you know, his buildings, you know, I think have a value now because there's not a lot of them. You know, there's a scarcity, and you know, they're not a dime a dozen. You know, so you know, and whilst even people, you know, I think most people that would buy them would know, you know, who he was. But even if someone didn't know who he was, you know, the detailing is exquisite. You know, you can tell the value without actually having to know its provenance.
Exactly. Yeah, another one of those things that represents the complexity of what we're talking about. It's not just about scarcity, it's about the fact that it's the design and the implementation is done so well. It's that whole package. Awesome. Well, Paul, for those who want to find out more about you and more about what you're doing and your upcoming book and your podcast, tell us, how can people find you?
Well, podcast is The Common Creative, which is on Spotify and Apple and all good providers of podcasts. And we'll have you on the show in the not too distant future, Jonno, which I'm looking forward to. You can find me at paulfairweather.com, and I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So that's where you can find me, and my email is hello@paulfairweather.com.
And with your book, what's the time frame? People might be listening to this
look,
in the future.
I don't know. It's been going for years. I'm working with them. I'm getting close. It's called Bald, Brave, and a Bit Quirky. So it's lessons from of creative misadventures.
I can't wait for that to be out there in the world. So if people are listening to this down the track, maybe you can Google it, see if this has helped Paul just to get that push through the finishing line in the next little while, because I'm sure the world will enjoy it. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. I always love the idea that someone's, you know, at the gym or going for a jog somewhere and just, you know, maybe what Paul shared today in some of his story was just what you needed to hear to encourage you or challenge you in your journey. I love that idea. And most of all, I want to say thank you to you, Paul. I love the tangents we went on, and it's makes perfect sense with what you do around creativity. But I really did feel like sometimes with this podcast, I just follow my questions, and that's okay. But what I really enjoyed about today was just getting to know a glimpse of your story and the way you think. And it's really, there's so many things in my head going around that I'm going to kind of ponder and sit on from today. And so I think as well, it's been really valuable for the listeners to hear some of the stories you shared, perspectives. It's just been a joy. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Jonno. It's been great chatting with you. I really, really enjoyed it. So